Hi folks and welcome back. Now I got to stream a few hours of the new Total War Pharaoh game recently, and if you'd like to see how that went you can check out the link in the description and watch the initial gameplay. But if you just want to know my first impressions and thoughts overall of the game, well, they're going to follow now. Now if you're familiar with the Total War franchise, you might want to nip ahead to the next chapter where I describe what's new in Total War Pharaoh and give you my thoughts and impressions on it overall. But if you've never played one of these before, then this is what it's all about. The Total War series have been around for decades now and are mostly known for their historical war games combining turn-based strategy and empire management followed by real-time battles where you're in control of the units on the ground. The idea always being to pick a leader or a faction, build up your empire, raise vast armies and go forth and conquer all your neighbours. There are elements of trade and diplomacy thrown in as well, but more often than not it's just a case of raise as many big armies as you can afford and go forth and trash the enemy. Total War Pharaoh is definitely in the historical camp here, being set in ancient Egypt, and the idea is to pick one of the Egyptian lords or factions or one of their neighbours and, you've guessed it, build up your empire and perhaps become Pharaoh and ruler of the Nile. You start out quite small and the idea is to build up those few settlements you've got so you can recruit better troops, keep those troops alive through their battles so they gain experience and become veterans and fight more effectively for you, and then raise bigger armies as your cash and resources are allowed. Now cash isn't just everything in this, there's also food, bronze and stone which you'll use for building things in your cities, raising armies, supplying the units, etc, etc. You can go for outright domination, trying to take over every settlement on the map that's provided, or you can just try and play out your particular character's ambitions and win that way. So there's a little bit of variation on the victory conditions. When a battle takes place between two opposing armies, the battlefields are generated based on the terrain those armies actually occupied on the terrain map, at least to some extent, and yes, this does mean that you get to fight over towns and cities and fight sieges as well. So I've been playing various Total War games for over 20 years, and I happen to think that the older ones were possibly in some ways better than the newer ones, but there are some new additions in Pharaoh that I hadn't seen before. First off, they've got some court intrigue added in. This is where your Egyptian character tries to play the court of nobles, trying to improve their position through blackmail, through bribery, through perhaps assassination. The idea being to gain influence over some of the other nobles that you can then call in favours, or you can just boost your own character's standing in the realm, giving you a better shot at gaining support at becoming Pharaoh one day. It's nice and interesting. It's something you can do every single turn. Different characters have different amount of actions that they can play out in the court. Whether it's something that you will enjoy depends on how much you like it. It's something that I think the developers wanted to make a large part of the game. Also new to me was the outpost system. Now if you break down each of the regions of your empire, you've got like a capital of a particular region plus 2 or 3 smaller outlying settlements. But within those areas where the settlements are, you can now build outposts as well. These can be simple things like guard towers or a shrine to your particular god or a fort. This was new, and I think this addresses to some extent one of the issues with the building slot system they have in this game, which limits settlements to how many things and upgrades they can build in an area. This now allows you to offload some of the demand on the limited building slots onto the outposts should you want to build a shrine or a fort or just a watchtower, which would then boost your vision range into enemy territory. It's not perfect, and we'll talk more about this later. Your armies can also interact with these outposts to gain additional buffs and bonuses, albeit temporary. For example, if one of your armies visits a shrine, then they might get a morale boost for a couple of turns or a particular benefit to one of the actions that might be related to what that god is all about. For example, if it's a god of pillage, you might get a benefit to raiding for a couple of turns afterwards. So the idea is to build these outposts and have your armies interact with them. I found some issues with this in that, yes, it can be nice if everything is lined up and the outpost is where your army wants to be moving to, but as armies only have a limited range on the campaign map, it was a bit of a pain in the backside trying to move them back to an outpost to get a particular buff to then move them out to do whatever they were going to do for the next turn or two. They've also got General's Bodyguards units in this game. Now, I didn't play the recent Shogun Total War, but I have played the Warhammer stuff and the previous historical stuff. And this works different to both of those. You have a General's Bodyguard unit, and you can equip them with weapons that you loot and win on the battlefield. So if you want them to use bows, you can equip them with a bow. If you want them to be melee infantry, you can equip them with a sword and a shield, or an axe and a shield, or a great big two-handed club, or whatever you want. Remember, this is ancient Egypt. It's not medieval weaponry you're using here. So there's some interesting things, and that's kind of nice that you can feel like you're building up your bodyguards as you go along. When I say bodyguards, they are like a whole military unit. It's not just 2 or 3 defending a big lord like in Warhammer Fantasy stuff. This is a unit of soldiers. And talking about the generals as well, your characters, your lords, then they also have stats in this. You do level them up in combat if they survive. However, you don't just pick perks when you've got experience points. You have to level up their stats, and if you have enough points in one particular stat, you'll be able to pick a particular trait that you can use, and you can slot up to 4 traits, I believe, and you can slot these in and out depending on the situation as required. I don't know that it's really any better, because the better traits just require more points in the stat that they're related to, so you find that you do have to level up all the stats that you want anyway, and you may as well have just worked down a perk tree like you did in Warhammer Fantasy, but I guess it's something a little bit different that I thought's worth mentioning here. And that's about all I've discovered new in the 4 hours or so I've played this both on and off stream, and the game has not left me wanting to play anymore. I've been disappointed with the Total War series historical games that they've released over the last few years. I think since Rome 2 Total War, I don't think they've gone quite in the right direction with things, and I much preferred the older games, Medieval Total War 1 and 2, the original Rome, and even the Empire and Napoleon Total War to some extent. But the system they've got in the games that they churn out now, there's several things that I just don't enjoy, and one is the limited building slots per region or per settlement. But the building slots per region means you are massively limited in what you can build. You've got a capital in each region, which has a lot more building slots, and then you can build your better barracks and your crown buildings to improve the mood and loyalty of the population. There's all sorts of things you can build there, but the other outlying settlements, usually 2 or 3 extra ones in a region, they're a lot more limited. And because the army upkeep is so great in this, and the more armies you have, the more each army costs in upkeep, then you feel like you really have to just pump out anything that produces extra resources. I ran into trouble very, very quickly in the game trying to afford the upkeep of my armies, mainly through bronze, which meant I should probably have been recruiting mostly trash militia units, which would have just cost me extra food anyway, and then I would have struggled to win the few battles that I did engage in. And this is all because of the building slot system. I think you can't build all the buildings you want. Now, they have tried to address this by adding outposts. You can build forts and guard towers, but only one of each in each settlement. So if you had a really rough border area that you knew was going to get raided, you couldn't build 3 forts in it. You could have 1 fort and then have to build 2 different outposts there. You can man the fort with a garrison, and the garrison will come out to fight if you have a field army fighting nearby as well, within range. It's nice that they've tried to address this building slot issue, but I still have the issue with building slots, and I can't get everything I needed to run my empire properly. This wasn't a problem in the older games at all. But it also, I think, breaks these games a little bit, or breaks the immersion of them anyway, is when you get into the tactical battles, there's several things that don't happen in Total War games anymore that used to back in the days. And this is, I think, particularly important for historical war games, because they get this wrong now. And that is, in particular, if a unit gets charged in the flank or rear or is totally surrounded, that unit will still fight to the death in the modern Total War games, and that happens in Total War Pharaoh as well. There is no sudden panic, there is no sudden fear, they don't try to rush and flee away, they realise they're being surrounded or about to be surrounded and chopped to pieces. They will fight to the death, and units will generally fight to the death in this game, or until they're so small as to be worthless anywhere. There's no running away and panicking and maybe rallying, which is, in the old days of Total War games, what your general is most useful for, running around rallying troops and bringing them back into the battle and steadying the ship, so to speak. No, here units will fight to the death even when surrounded, and then break and be unusable for the rest of the battle because they're in such a small amount. Also, and this happens far, far, far too many times, when a unit does eventually break and flee, it will flee through enemy units, even if it's surrounded, and those enemy units will do it next to nothing to stop it. So for me, for a historical war game, this is like a particular big failing. Another thing, and I don't want to sound like such an old man, but I guess I probably am now, but another thing that happened in the old games that doesn't happen in any of the modern Total War games is that there's no integrity of your battle lines of your army. In the old days, this is what made it a historical war game, you had to try and maintain a battle line. Each unit would look to its flanks and rear, and if it had supporting units there, its morale would be boosted, and as soon as that battle line broke, there was a good chance that the other units then would panic because they had enemy on their flanks or on their rear, and they might run. And that was especially true of lower quality troops. Very historical, this all sounds, right? That doesn't happen now. I've already mentioned how units will very rarely, or if ever, they'll never rout or flee if they're surrounded or charged in the sides. But also, you don't get battle lines anymore. As soon as a battle starts, it just devolves into a massive brawl of 10 units fighting their own individual battles in 10 different parts of the map, because the enemy just moves all over the place. Your units don't really react as they should, and you never see that epic clash of battle lines like from the film Alexander, or from Gladiator, or from any of those ancient historical epics. You just don't see that. It just looks like an uncontrolled brawl taking place in 10 different places on the map, rather than a fight, rather than a battle. It's scrappy, it doesn't look good, it doesn't feel good, it makes it harder for you to control because you as a player can only be in one place at a time, whereas the AI can control all of their units individually all the time, because that's how the AI works. So for me, the battles don't feel like historical battles at all, and the empire management side of the game feels clunky. So I'm definitely out at that point, and unfortunately I've got this exact same complaint about most of the recent Total War games. The Fantasy Warhammer stuff was a little different and a little better in other respects, with more focus on lords and heroes, as the tabletop fantasy stuff was. But Total War Pharaoh falls into the same pit that the other previous historical games have done. And that's my opinion on it. So is there anyone old enough here in the comments to remember the original Total War game? I think it was Shogun Total War. That was even so old that not even I played it. I was introduced to medieval Total War 1, then the Viking Invasion, and then 2, and I absolutely loved those games. They felt great. Rome came after, I think, or was it in between? That was also good. And then, ever since then, I think they've gone slightly off course, and I just don't like their recent offerings. But that's just me. Let me know what you think, if it's any different. So that's my opinion on Total War Pharaoh. I won't be playing it. At the moment, I'm going to be streaming more of Starfield, which is another game that's full of problems, but that one oddly draws me into wanting to play, and I can't explain why, because the game not very well made in a lot of respects and has a lot of issues, but for some reason, I want to go play it. So I'll be streaming that live probably as you are watching this. Anyway, do come and check us out. Do say hello if you can catch me live, and I'll look forward to seeing you on the next one.